This episode of the podcast is brought to you by Canna Health.
What if you had such a clear understanding of your own DNA and genetic makeup that you could make informed decisions about what type of cannabis products interact best with your system? Well, now you can with EndoDNA. EndoDNA is a simple DNA test that maps your entire endocannabinoid system and then matches that summary with the specific cannabinoid ratio and terpene profile that aligns with your unique genotype. Imagine being armed with personal information when visiting a dispensary. You'll have the power and capability to purchase products that best align to your genotype. Visit their website to purchase the EndoDNA collection kit and Endo Decoded report at endodna.com/product and use the promo code CONNECT15 for a 20% discount. Again, that's endodna.com/product and use the promo code CONNECT15 for a 20% discount. The future of cannabinoid therapeutics is here with EndoDNA. Hello again, my fellow people of the plant. In this episode of Cannabinoid Connect, I'm talking with Kristi Price. She's the founder and CEO of KRMA Media, which is the parent company of Black CannaBusiness magazine. Kristi is also the founder of the Black Canna Conference and Expo, which is the nation's only national conference for cannabis professionals of color. During our conversation, we talk about Kristi's background and how she got into cannabis. We talk about cannabis use in the communities of color. We also talk about the Black CannaBusiness magazine's origin story. Last, we talk about the Black Canna Conference and Expo and why she chose NOLA as the destination. So I hope you enjoy this episode of Cannabinoid Connect with Kristi Price, who is the founder and CEO of KRMA Media, which is the parent company of the Black CannaBusiness magazine. Hello, Kristi Price. How are you?
I am wonderful, Kevin. How are you?
I'm doing well. I'm really excited to talk to you today. I'm glad that we were able to make it happen and interested in
Me
talking
too.
more and learning more about, your company, KRMA Media, but then also Black Cannabis, CannaBusiness magazine, excuse me. And then, of course, Black Canna Con, which is a conference coming up in New Orleans. But
Yeah.
before we do all that and get into all the exciting stuff, let's talk about you first. Let's
Okay.
get to know your background. I saw in your LinkedIn profile that you have some big brand experience working for Infosys, Nike, and now you're in cannabis. So why don't you
hmm
talk about that transition?
Sure. Yeah. I'd like to talk about that transition because I think it's always so important. Everybody in cannabis now has a pre-cannabis career, right? Like no one or very few people started and stayed, in the cannabis industry for their whole career. So it's always interesting to talk about what led people to cannabis. So I think it's only fair that I share my story too, because that's the same question I ask a lot of people when I meet them. So my formal education is in mass communications and actually broadcast journalism. But after college,
Bless your
broadcast
heart.
journalism is one of those
That's
things I was like, didn't want
yeah.
to work for free for long,
And work hard, right? I
and
mean, yeah, you're busting
super
ass.
hard and move around and do all that kind of good stuff. And so that was not in the plans for me. I decided against that route. And so I ended up working as like a marketing communications and diversity marketing communications professional. So I worked for and was really fortunate to work for some in some other formerly prohibited industries. So when we think about cannabis, same thing with alcohol and tobacco. I spent about 10 years in the tobacco industry, about 8 years in the alcohol industry. And so, the nuances of doing business and communicating in those types of industries, which is really unique. And of course, when I was in those spaces, I wasn't thinking about cannabis then.
Right.
But as my
Man,
career
what a great
progressed,
skill set to learn, though. I
yeah,
mean, that's totally needed on the marketing and comm side. So what a
yeah,
leg up, you know?
yeah, you're right. It does feel like a bit of a leg up. And that is why, when I was thinking about what I wanted to do in the industry, in the cannabis. Like I knew I wanted to be involved. I just didn't know what, like a lot of people, when you first hear about the industry, you're like, oh, okay. And then whether you're a consumer or an investor or just
Me, I mean, that was
a
that was this
founder.
that was the same with me also. Like I went to the first
Hmm.
hemp conference and I'm like, where do I fit in here? I'm not
Yeah.
I'm not a grower. I'm not a
Yeah.
scientist, so I get it. Go ahead. Yeah, this
Yeah.
is
I mean,
awesome.
so I think, and again, it's something that I think a lot of us in the industry have kind of gone through. And then you kind of trial and error, you do some research and you figure it out. And I think for me, I just wanted to make sure whatever I did like added value to the industry. Like I
Yes.
didn't want to just get in the industry to take from it or to make millions and millions of dollars. I mean, that was never my focus. It was always about, what I could do to help improve, to help affect in a positive way, the industry.
That's a great
And
mindset to have, by the way. I mean, that's
well,
exactly, add value, not noise, is what I like to say often.
yeah,
There's a lot of noise out there, and
right.
if you're going in with the objective to do so, especially with an industry that's so new and is desperately
Hmm.
needed of those services, then that's a winning combination.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And so yeah, so a big part of this too for me was recognizing as a person of color, just how few faces like mine, that I saw in the industry going to conferences and reading articles and just doing your due diligence. It's kind of like, you start looking for folks that maybe you have some things in common with. And it was
Right.
just very few and far between for people of color. So then it was like, okay,
Was that surprising to you?
it was surprising to me. It was
It
very surprising to me because in a lot of ways, people of color are, build or have created much of the culture
right.
around cannabis and their
Totally.
music and food and just lifestyle, just the whole thing. So I did expect to see more than I did see. I mean, I didn't think it would be the majority. I mean, because again, we're still in the U.S. and America. I mean, people of color are still the minority, but I definitely expected to see more than I did.
Right. Yeah. And I think there could be a lot of reasons why, right? And
Hmm.
one that kind of sticks out to me, and I think it's just the obvious one, is that like business is difficult for anyone,
Hmm.
right? Like to start. Doesn't matter who
Right.
you are, right? If you don't have the resources, the capital, everything that you would need, it's tough to get going. And add cannabis to the mix, which
Hmm.
is the most highly regulated, and in a lot of ways the most expensive kind of
Yeah.
industry to jump into. I could see there's just a lot of barriers, right?
Hmm.
Like, so
Yeah.
it's interesting. So that kind of, I guess, motivated you, right, to kind of
Hmm.
think through like, what can I do to make a difference and help?
Yeah, I mean, exactly. It's like, and so the first part of my career was focused on those other formally prohibited, highly regulated, like you mentioned, industries. And then the second half of my career, but right before cannabis, for like the last 7 years, I've been working as a management consultant. So kind of solving industry or business problems, right? So,
Right.
and I specialized in communications because of course that's my background. And so when I began to think about like where the gaps were in the industry, particularly for people of color, it was what you were talking about. It was in that space, that gap that there is between wanting to be in the industry and being able to get involved in the
Right.
industry and overcoming those barriers to inclusion that exist. And for people of color and for minorities, in addition to just regular business barriers that a lot of people go through, regardless of the color of your skin, or your culture, there's a stigma associated, with the cannabis industry and a lot of Black and brown communities that really also kind of act as a barrier,
Yeah.
because there's that you tell your parents or you tell your uncle or someone that this is the industry you wanted to go into, and immediately the thoughts are of the legalities and the criminal justice system and that thing. So that's another like extra hurdle, that Black and brown communities have to go over. And
Totally.
so that
Crit-
was a big part of this plan.
Totally. I can totally agree. I mean, myself being a Latino male, right, and growing
Right.
up, like I wanted to get into that, and I was going to ask. It's a perfect segue. So, like, the perception of cannabis use or even involvement in the industry in communities of color, right?
Right.
And I'll tell you, like from a Latino standpoint, like it's, I mean, for the older generation, you're a
Mhm.
marijuano, you're a lazy person, you're just,
Yeah.
you're up to no good, smoking pot all day. And it's real, right? There's like
Mhm.
this double standard. So is it the
Mhm.
same within the African American community?
Oh, absolutely. Because when you think about the war on drugs and the groups of people who were just, and I know you can attest to this too, the groups of people who were just disproportionately impacted by that, that's a big conversation, in the Black community. It is how that whole time of this, during the country, that was when we were going through that episode, it was like so many Black and brown families were decimated
Mm-hmm.
by this, and by that, those policies. And so that, and those memories remain, that history still kind of is there. There's people still in
Totally.
prison 20 years later, from, for having a couple of joints in their pocket. And now we see, folks who don't look like us making millions, billions of dollars, or potentially making billions of dollars. So yeah, it's certainly another challenge, but even more of a reason why the work that we're doing to create a more inclusive industry is so important.
Yeah, no, totally. And it's good to see. I mean, like, we can always do better, right? But there are, you know, companies out there that are
Hmm.
taking this approach and making it top of mind, right?
Right.
Because like to your point, there's still so many people of color that have been disenfranchised by the plant. And I think it's approximately 40,000 that are still in prison, right?
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
so the industry, we got to do our part, and also like we got to push the government as well, right? Like when
Right.
they're coming out and proposing draft legislation for federal legalization of cannabis,
Hmm.
and they're talking about social equity being their top priority. Well,
Hmm.
I think, and I'm really a believer of this now after my conversation with Brooke Butler from
Hmm.
Simplifia, and we talked about how important the education part is, right?
Right.
Because not only like is the capital really difficult as an entry barrier,
Hmm.
right, and having the funds available to help people of color who have been disenfranchised, but also like the next level of like education and know-how, and
Hmm.
and a lot of cases people will come back and say that's not the government's job, right?
Right.
But in this case, the government imposed prohibition for the last 100 years. I think it's
Hmm.
their duty
Hmm.
to help as much as they can if they're in fact talking about social equity being their main priority, right?
Correct. Hmm. Yeah, and I think to that point, you're absolutely, absolutely correct. I do believe that there is a responsibility that the onus is on the groups or the organizations that created this mess
This mess.
of. I
Yeah.
mean, that's basically what it is. It's kind of like we're there's the mindset about money first, and people last, and that's backwards. And I think, and when we're thinking about these policies, when we're talking to politicians about the types of things that we can write up or enact to kind of level the playing field for folks, if we lead with people, I mean, we really can't go wrong.
Mhm.
There's no conversation you'll have where anyone would disagree that we need to take a real hard look at not only the criminal justice system and how to make amends with those folks who have been disenfranchised by the plant. I like the way you said that. But then also look at the structures and the systems that created the mess,
Yeah.
and kind of start there by having people of color and people who are impacted negatively be a part of those policy writing conversations, and make sure that that vocabulary reflects, those things that are important to those communities.
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree more. It's like no one's winning right now, right? Like
Right.
like the criminals aren't winning because they're getting thrown, they're like stacked on top of each other. The taxpayer's not winning because we're paying money to lock people up for a plant, right?
Yeah.
Where other states it's legal. It's just kind of like you said, it's a mess right now. And so
Hmm.
I would imagine that Black Cannabis Magazine, BCBM, is a great platform to really communicate, like,
Hmm.
the awareness and getting the word out and like talking about these issues, right?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. Because one of the things about being a Black person or a person of color in business is that you are still a person of color, even in business. So there are So there are some things, some conversations, some plans that need to be made, collectively as a community, to help make sure that we aren't left behind, as the industry progresses. And that's kind of the goal of Black Cannabis Magazine. And it's kind of to marry both the business conversation and sustainability and success and Black business excellence, have those conversations, amplify those stories, but then at the same time, also think through and talk about, like, as a community, what we need to be planning and organizing to make sure that, again, we're moving forward, that our voices are being heard, as policies are being written, and that our people are being, recognized, as the criminal justice reform starts to take place across the country.
Yeah.
So lots of work to do, lots of conversations to have, and they can't happen like as an aside or between other conversations. It needs to be an ongoing conversation.
Yeah, it needs. Yeah, I totally agree, and especially now, right? Where
Right.
like we've got the most eyeballs, most public support ever, right? Like
Hmm.
I think the last poll was like 92% of Americans support legal cannabis.
Yeah.
I keep saying, I joke, like the only issue that Americans agree on in
Right.
2020.
Right. One of the few.
Right.
For
Well,
sure.
I got ahead of myself. So because we got into some really important points, which I think we needed to dive deep into, but,
Hmm.
let me pull it back a bit. So let's talk about like the origin story of BCBM, and maybe even starting with KRMA Media.
Hmm. Yeah. So maybe about 4 years ago, I mentioned earlier that I was a management consultant, and I was like in an Uber listening to satellite radio, and I heard a conversation that folks were having on the radio about the cannabis industry. I think I must have been in New York. I was somewhere on the East Coast, and it was, the diversity and inclusion and equity was like part of this conversation. And as I was listening to the radio, I recognized that there was like no person of color a part of this conversation on this particular program, and I thought that was interesting.
Yeah.
And so as I started to do some more research and just still thinking about how I wanted to show up in this industry, I started to hear a lot of the same stories. It was that, there were just so few conversations being led by people of color, let alone even being included in conversations. And I started to think about,
What year
again,
ago? What year was this?
this was like 2018.
Okay.
So this was about 3 or 4 years ago when this was going on. And so I took some time to do my own research, traveled, went to all the conferences, networked with people on LinkedIn. I mean, it took me a minute just to really figure out what I wanted to do. And then I finally figured that if I could just marry like both my passions, professional passions, which was that of communications and management consulting and supporting business, that's kind of where KRMA Media was born out of. I wanted to create like the premier business to business publisher for people of color in the cannabis industry. That was kind of my goal, and I felt like creating a media company and leveraging media to do that. Because you talked about earlier about how important education is in this space.
Yeah.
And there are lots of minority communities where the education, like the curve is really, really steep. There's a lot of information that if we really want to keep up with the pace at which the cannabis industry is growing, we have to be knowledgeable. And so
Totally.
that was the gap that I recognized. And that was a gap that I wanted to fill with KRMA
That's
Media.
that's amazing. And so two questions about KRMA. One, is there any meaning behind the name? Like personal meaning or?
There is a meaning. So it is a play on words. So karma does mean karma. It's a kind of like, the same element or the plant that was used to disenfranchise so many Black and brown communities. Now we're flipping the script.
Love it.
And we're going to, take power over the plant and our cultures and our communities and use it, for the good
That's cool.
of what we're doing. So that's the karma piece. But
Yeah.
then each of those letters is KRMA, and they each kind of represent a pillar or a promise that I wanted to keep, with all of the brands that, fall under the KRMA umbrella. And we talked a lot about education. So knowledge, so K is for knowledge. R is for resources. I want to be able to provide those business resources for our readers and our followers. M is for minority curation. So everything we do is really curated for the minority reader, and Black and brown business owners, entrepreneurs, but also we have an A, which is for allies. So yes, a lot of the work that we're doing and the things that we focus on with KRMA Media is for our minority communities, but we also know that we have allies. And like you mentioned earlier, there are businesses and brands that are really leading with social equity. And so we believe that it's our responsibility to acknowledge that work and, to the groups and the communities that benefit from those investments that those organizations are making. So that's kind of what KRMA stands for.
Love it. Yeah, you could tell you took a lot of thought to and it all makes sense. It all bubbles up to your business model, right? I mean, that's business 101. So well done there.
Thanks.
My next question related to KRMA is before we recorded, when we first met, we talked over the phone. You mentioned you're in Houston.
Yeah.
So, Texas girl, I'm in Texas also. So
yeah.
What's it like operating, a cannabis forward media company in the state of Texas?
Well, I think that, it's business is business. And I believe like the longer we live, the more global, working is, so where you are is not as much of a barrier for inclusion in some industries as it might have been maybe 10 or 15 years ago. So totally. That's the good news. And then also, as a consultant, I traveled like 100%. So Houston is my home base, but I've spent lots of time on the West Coast, East Coast, definitely in the Midwest, and spaces and areas where, cannabis has been legal a little bit longer, in those emerging markets where, the more progressive cannabis conversations, have been happening. So though home base is Texas, I was born though, and the home state is Louisiana, and we'll get to that in a minute. Yes. But just my travels with work, and the opportunities that I've had to kind of see the country and the world, I think has really enabled me to have a more global view about how I operate business wherever I am.
Yeah, no, I totally agree about the whole remote work aspect because I've operated two businesses in one job and I'm remote, right? So there's that. And it's got to be funny for you though, right? To be so in deep in these different states with these clients that are really, really, like you said, progressive, in their cannabis laws. And then you come back to Texas and, we're talking about adding a couple elements to the medical program,
Right.
So we got a lot of work, but I get it. It's not your canvas. It's your home base,
Right.
Yeah. Right. Awesome. So, well, let's get into the upcoming Black CannaCon conference. And I guess perfect segue there is Louisiana. It's in NOLA. And I got to tell you, I was in New Orleans for the first time, 3 years ago.
Wow.
And it was awesome. I loved it.
The first time.
I know it took me that long.
Where
Can
have
you believe it? I know. I'm embarrassed, but I loved it. It was a great city. So tell us first, maybe an overview about the conference, and then specifically why NOLA is the destination.
Well, I'm super excited. The conference, the Black Canna Conference this is the second year for the conference. The first year was last year. We did it virtually, all online, and it went really well. We had over 800 registrants, and we had over 40 speakers. Put the conference together in 6 weeks. It was bananas. It was great. And coming out of that conference, the resounding comment was when can we do this in person, right? Because one of the things about the industry when we talk about travel and stuff is that it's very siloed,
right?
So if you're not in the state that this work is happening in, the chances are of you knowing about it is very low. Or knowing the people that are doing the same work that you're doing, or organizations that could help you do, what you want to do. So that was eye-opening for a lot of attendees of the virtual conference, because they were like, oh my God, I didn't even know there were this many people, in the space doing what I'm doing or wanting to do what I'm doing. So
Is it
that was the
because they
first.
saw it like up hand, like
Yeah.
virtually? They saw the names and they
Yeah,
saw
you
the
see the names and
yeah.
faces, and it's like, what? And it's like, you're doing this, what? And it's just, that was a big thing. So immediately coming out of that, we were like, we have to get together. So that, the virtual conference for me just kind of solidified, and acknowledged that there was a space for an organ or for an event like this in the cannabis industry. And so this year, coming into 2021, I knew I was going to do the conference again. And I felt pretty confident that we, had figured out kind of how to live with, COVID and all those things that were kind of preventing us from getting together last year in person.
Right.
And when I was thinking about where to do it, I could not think of a better place than Louisiana, New Orleans in particular. It's a very easy sell. Like you just said, you went to New Orleans a couple of years
great.
ago and you had a blast.
Yeah.
So
the energy there is incredible. Like,
yeah,
I walked past a playground, and there was a basketball court, and they weren't playing basketball. They were playing
yeah,
music. They were playing
yeah.
drums. It was amazing. It
It's
was
a whole vibe.
incredible.
Like it's a
Yeah.
whole different type of place. And when you think about like cannabis conferences, so many of them are in Vegas or in, other parts of the country. And I just wanted to create, have a more centralized location. I thought the South was really great when we were thinking that, our target attendees are
Right.
people of color. And I mean, all roads lead down south. I mean, I talk to people in Portland and New York, and everyone's like, oh, I have an aunt or my grandmother or my uncle or someone is down here, or the roots come down here. So it was just really easy for me. I graduated from Southern University in Baton Rouge. So,
Nice.
Louisiana and New Orleans has always been very close to my heart. So I'm very excited to be bringing the conference to one of my favorite cities.
That sounds amazing. And it's so cool that really sparked the need to meet in person. Everybody was so jazzed up from the virtual event, where it's like, look, no, we can do much more if we're in person, which of course, right, I think is there's just that human element too, that human connection. You want to be there. I want to ask you, I'm curious, what is the current state of like cannabis laws in Louisiana? I don't hear much about that state. What's going on there?
Well, Louisiana is very quietly being very progressive. So they're much more progressive than Texas. And as a matter of fact, in January, they're legalizing flower in Louisiana.
Wow.
They've already decriminalized for the most part. And they've also decriminalized consuming cannabis, like by smoking. So lots of legislation that's coming along in Louisiana. Lots of really interesting stories that are coming out of Louisiana in terms of the people who live there and their experiences with cannabis. And so it's just going to be really exciting to host this event in New Orleans. The other thing about Louisiana and why I thought New Orleans was an important place is that, Louisiana is still, and has been for many years, the state with the highest incarceration rate, period. I think in the world. I was going to say in the country, but I think the last time I heard someone say it was in the world, but we can check that, verify that for sure. But again, my goal is just to shed light on the industry in a good way, and then also to raise awareness about the work that there's still remains to be done in terms of equity in the criminal justice system as well. So we have a lot of responsibility in this space as people of color, and so that's kind of what this cannabis industry and the Canna conference and the work that I'm doing with Black CannaBusiness is all about.
I love the passion, and I love you just like taking charge and saying, look, if we don't do this, we're not going to be heard. And
right.
Like, it's like we don't help us, like ourselves, and no one's going to help us.
Right.
And so, and what they need, what everyone needs is the right education, the guidance, right? The know-how, the skill set, the coaching, the mentoring. There's so much that's involved in starting a business, like we said, and let alone in the cannabis industry. Are you kidding me? Right.
Yeah.
So it's just great to see people like you, Kristi, that are stepping up and helping, like, again, people that have been disenfranchised by the plant. And it's amazing to see. When is the conference and how can people register?
So the conference is November the 18th through the 20th. It's at the Convention Center there in New Orleans, the Ernest M. Morial Convention Center. And if anyone is interested in learning more about the conference or registering to attend, you can certainly go to our website, which is blackcannaconference.com. Pretty easy. All the information is there for passes if you just want to come to the conference and attend the expo. And then there's also information if you're interested in being an exhibitor. So our expo this year is going to be paying homage to Black Wall Street, since this is the 100th year anniversary of the Black Wall Street massacre, and a lot of conversations have been having what we had earlier this year around that topic. And so we just kind of wanted to end the year in this industry also, respecting and reflecting on those business communities that existed before we were even born, that kind of paved the way for us as Black and brown folks to be professionals and successful in business.
Yeah, paying tribute is so important, right? Like,
absolutely,
it goes back to everything you said, like taking charge, paying tribute, making sure that we're doing this right, because we only get one shot, right?
Yep.
I mean, it's moving fast. It's crazy.
Really fast, really, really fast.
Yeah. Well, I really appreciate your time. Why don't you let people know your website and social media if they want to follow you to learn more?
Sure. So I'm most active on LinkedIn. So it's Kristi C. Price on LinkedIn. And then we also have Black Canna Conference and Black Cannabis Magazine on LinkedIn. So you can find us both with those titles. And again, the website is blackcannaconference.com. And then we also have blackcannabusiness.com, which is where you can subscribe to our newsletter and learn more about everything that we're doing as a brand, even beyond the conference.
Perfect. And I'll be sure to drop those links in the YouTube description box so people can access them there as well. So
awesome.
Yes. Kristi, thank you so much again. Keep blazing the trails. Your work is much needed and super appreciated. And yeah, let's have you back on real soon.
Absolutely. Thanks, Kevin. I enjoyed our conversation.
Yes. And thank you all for listening. Bye.